All right, so we're going to cover a few things about university budgeting and finance and formula funding. I want to make this interactive, so if you have questions during my presentation, feel free to ask. And if you'd prefer, I'll save some time at the end for questions too. Okay? So we're going to cover the state budget overview, just to kind of walk you through how we get to higher education. And then look at higher education formula funding for general academics. This will not cover medical schools and health institutions, but this is just the general academics. Talk a little bit about legislative funding issues that may come up in the next session, and then how institutional funding and budgeting activities take place on campuses. So, state budget overview. There are many different sources of funds at the state, and when you get to the higher education level, we really have to look at, we kind of call it different colors of money, so we really have to segregate our funding and track it differently. So the state does similar, and we don't get all of these types of funds, but there's state tax collections, there's federal funds, fees and finance, lottery, so here's a little bit more detail about all of these. The general revenue fund is really the basis of the funding for the state of Texas, and most of it is state tax revenue. There's lottery proceeds in there, some investment income, and many of the state fees are in there as well. But then we have general revenue dedicated. And universities have some of this funds in the form of tuition revenue and fees, and then there's also other agencies get funding, state parks, Department of Insurance, and some other operating. Federal funds, grants from the federal government, higher education gets some of those. There's employee benefits on federal programs. And then other funds can be more specific, so we have state highway funding, Texas Mobility Fund, bond proceeds. Higher education may get some trusteed funds. University of Texas at Austin gets some funding for Alzheimer's as trusteed funds. There's license plate trust funds that also some of that goes to higher education. And then the available university fund is the funding that comes from our West Texas Lands Permanent University Fund, and that's really University of Texas and Texas A&M. So overall, the state has a $216.7 billion budget, and this is kind of how it breaks down between those different sources of funds. So you can see almost half of it is general revenue. And then if you look at all funds by function, you can see here higher education is about 9.5% of the total state budget, $20.5 billion. Then if you just look at general revenue, higher education is a little bit larger piece of the pie, about 14%, but you can kind of see health and human services and public education are really the largest pieces of the state budget. So how does higher education get their funding from the state? Well, there's a couple different ways, but formula funding is one way, and formula funding is intended to really equitably distribute these funds across the different institutions in the state. Then there's, and I'll talk a little bit more about how all of that works. Non-formula funding, these are things, and they were previously called special items, so you may hear that terminology as well. But non-formula items are things that are not funded through the formulas, and usually they're unique to an institution. They are specifically designated by the legislature for a very specific purpose. So for University of Texas at Austin, it could be things like McDonald Observatory, Marine Science Institute. Those are things that not every institution has, but they benefit the state in some way, and they could be a major research program or other types of special items, a public service of some kind as well. So other things that are not formula funding, available university funds, so that's a separate bucket of funds basically. There's a higher education fund that other institutions participate in, not University of Texas and not A&M. And then there's group insurance funding that comes to higher education to fund the health insurance of all of our employees. So the formulas are designed to cover the basic needs that every institution would have, every higher education academic institution. So we have faculty salaries, we have to pay operating expenses, we have libraries, there's research functions, there's instructional administration, that's things like dean's offices, of course student services, institutional support are people like me, the administration, and then infrastructure support, so our space and our facilities. And then I talked a little bit about this already, but things not in the formula funding, more specifically by types, the non-formula items, or what used to be special items like McDonald and MSI, Marine Science Institute, I'm sorry, I used that. Tuition revenue bonds are things, they are bonds that can be issued for major renovations or new facilities on campus, so that's not in the formulas. There's several different types of research funding. So the state of Texas is really trying to emphasize research and enhancing our research funding at every institution. So there's things for emerging institutions who aren't quite at the highest level of our flagship institutions, but they're growing and they're growing their research endeavors, and so the state wants to support that. So various different types of research funding. Some of them do have a formula within them, but it's separate from the overall funding formulas. And then, of course, AUF, Available University Fund, auxiliaries are, and other institutional funding are things that that happen on the campus, and they could be funds that are received. Athletics is an example, that is auxiliary services. There's housing and dining, that is also an auxiliary. So they're basically businesses within the university, and those funds are not generally managed by the state, they're managed at the institutional level. So the components of the formulas for the general academic institutions, there's really three pieces to it. So instruction and operation, and that is most of the formula. So that is the basics, all those things that were listed on the, what does the formula cover? So it's faculty salaries, libraries, student services, all of those things are included in that. And then infrastructure support is for our facilities and utilities, basically. And then there's a teaching experience supplement that is really to encourage tenured and tenure-track faculty to teach undergraduate courses. So it's a little supplement that institutions can receive. So those are the bases of the formula funding. There is also a small institution supplement for some institutions. It's really because of economies of scale. Larger institutions maybe have ability to economize better than some of the smaller institutions. So there's a supplement for those. And it really applies only to institutions with less than 10,000 students. So credit hours are very important to the formula, and they're really a piece of all of these. So they're driven by various pieces of the credit hours of our students. Infrastructure support actually has many more pieces to it, but part of it is also driven by credit hours taught. And then teaching experience, of course, as I mentioned, is for undergraduate credit hours that are taught by tenure and tenure-track faculty. So the basic concepts of the formula are there's a base period. They go out to all institutions and collect that enrollment data and semester credit hour data, and then there's weighted semester credit hours. And so the base period that gets used, well, there's some period of time that's used for the initial LBB runs of the formula, but then for the final runs that the legislature uses during their decision making, It's the summer and fall of even-numbered years, and then the spring of odd-numbered years. And so that base period provides the most recent information on expense data for every institution and the semester credit hours. So weighted semester credit hours are really a recognition that it doesn't cost the same to teach every type of course at a university. And so graduate courses may be more expensive to teach than undergraduate courses. They're generally smaller classes. Things in engineering or in natural sciences that have to have laboratories may be more expensive to teach. And so the weighting just recognizes that. And then there's an actual matrix, and I'll show you in a minute, that gets published into the appropriations bill that says how much each semester credit hour is valued for this formula. Once every institution turns in their semester credit hour information, it really becomes a giant formula. So every institution is providing that information, and the calculation is really just, so if you have a 3-hour course in history, history is one weight. So many of the liberal arts courses are one weight. So it's one weight. Let's say it's a 3-semester credit hour course. You have 20 students. The weighted semester credit hour is 60. Just a basic formula. So you can go through it and look at all these other ones. But here's what the matrix looks like. And it's printed in the appropriations bills. So you can see liberal arts, lower division is one weight. And then as you go out, some of the larger, so for teacher education doctoral, 6.91, and business administration master's is 3.26. So it varies, and they're really looking at how much does it cost. And one thing I should point out, the cost is averaged across all institutions in the state of Texas. And so University of Texas turns theirs in, A&M, Permian Basin, all Lamar, they all turn in their semester credit hours and their average expenses. That's done through a cost study. And so this is how this is determined. So everything is at an average. Some are high, some institutions are higher, some are lower, but this represents the average of all institutions in the state of Texas. And so you get from semester credit hour to the dollar value. The legislature sets the weighting per semester, the dollar value of each weighting every session. And so for 18-19, it was $55.82 per weight. So they just went in and, again, a very, very big formula for all the institutions and all the weighting, but you can just do the calculation for that first one we looked at for a history course, 60 weighted semester credit hours, and the value is 55.82. You multiply that, so that class would get 3,349 and extrapolate it across all courses at all institutions, and that's how that formula is done. That makes sense? And so this is what it would look like if you just plugged it into that previous matrix and multiply it by 55.82. There is also an infrastructure support formula. So that was the instruction and operations. So this is the infrastructure. And I know Tom's going to talk more about the space and infrastructure formula, so I won't get into this too much. But it's really just, currently, it's looking at what the campuses, it's not what each campus actually has in facilities, but it's what the formula would generate. That's really how it works. And there are some adjustments for utilities and small institutions again. But I'll let Tom cover that more. And here's the space model and the different factors. So the teaching experience, just very is just a simple add-on supplement to the formula for the number of courses and semester credit hours taught by faculty, tenured and tenure track faculty. Okay. So that's really how the formulas work. It is very much a formula that is distributed. It's a distribution method, I guess I should say. And so the legislature decides how much money they're going to put into it, and then the pie is distributed through the formula. So growing institutions really benefit because as they grow, they get a larger piece of the pie. So after all of that formula funding goes through, here's what it looks like for general revenue appropriated by function at institutions across the state. So as I said, the instruction and operations is one of the higher ones, and so that's the blue section here. I can't even read it. I guess I need to change the color on that, 57.3%. But it's the largest piece of the pie, but then you can see there's different tuition revenue bonds are on here, infrastructure support. So this is broken down, a picture of all of higher ed, how it's broken by function across the universities. Okay, so that really kind of covers the formula funding issues. Are there any questions you want to ask at this point, or you want me to keep going? All right. Keep going. So the legislative funding issues. Some of the things that have been coming up over the last several sessions are related to outcomes-based funding. So really looking at what each institution is doing and how successful they are in graduating students, which is really the purpose of higher education. So the coordinating board and the committees within the coordinating board have really tried to look at what's the best way to get at this and how do we incentivize universities to continue to do better and continue to have more success in graduating students. And there have been a few different recommendations on this, and so it's kind of gone through various processes. One of them was really to look at success metrics, and this was introduced, and each institution really got to choose the priorities for their institutions. Some have more at-risk students, and it's more important for them to focus on at-risk students. And so some have more undergraduate degrees, some are wanting to retain students. So there were various metrics, and each institution could weight it based on what their priorities were. But I think this was kind of seen as a complicated methodology, and it really didn't go anywhere in the legislative session. And then the next iteration of this was a very simplified method, and it was looking at degrees awarded. $500 for each bachelor degree awarded by institution, and $1,000 if you have at-risk, because generally there's more cost to managing at-risk students and getting them graduated. And so there were actual bills filed on this, and several were introduced, but they did not pass. I think, is there already a bill filed for this session? I don't know if there is one filed yet, but there likely will be. And so this is something really that makes sense, and it's a simplified method, and so it may go forward. I think the biggest complication with this is the funding. Is it part of the formula that already exists, or is it going to be an add-on of money, and that could be a large amount? So that's something the legislature will have to do. Yes?
Thanks. What is the legislative definition of at-risk in this legislation?
I don't know if I have all of that information, but it's really looking at how the students are coming in from the type of loans they're getting, so financial need is part of it. But I don't have all of the metrics, but I can get you.
Our legislative proposal defines at-risk as basically Pell Grant eligible.
Yeah, Pell Grant.
Which is, you know, a poverty level issue. And then a below average ACT or SAT score. So there's a poverty issue or a family income issue, and then there's a academic.
Academic issue, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so again, I won't talk too much about this, but there was, Tom's going to talk a little bit more about the space projection model, and there was a bill introduced in the prior session that actually required us to look at the formulas for space and make some proposals, and so there'll be more on that. So there was also a non-formula and formula study that was required by the legislature. And so there was a joint interim committee of 5 members appointed by the lieutenant governor and 5 by the speaker to look at this. And the joint committee was to prepare a recommendation in April of 2018. They did look at the non-formula funding. I think there was some concern that what used to be called special items, now non-formula items, that some of them were intended to be like startup funds, that we have a new program and we need some startup funds, but then in 2 bienniums it's going to go away. Well, there was some concern that those never went away or that they aren't needed any longer, and so they really wanted to look at all of these non-formula funding needs. And there were actually some reductions that were implemented in the last legislative session to all of the non-formula items across the institutions in the state. And so I think everyone's kind of taking a hard look at those to really set the priorities and the ones that are most important. And so they did come out with a report. There was, well, actually 2 reports. There was Senate and the House kind of had some different recommendations, but overall they wanted us to put a classification to our non-formula items. So how do they fit in with instruction, research, or public service? And so those are all now categorized in the appropriations bill by that methodology. They also thought that there needed to be some look at both static enrollment and enrollment growth and cost inflation, so figure out a way to get that into the formulas. Looking at formula funding per student instead of by semester credit hour. So as you noted, all the weighted semester credit hours by semester credit hour. So looking at it by each student head count instead. And then question about how do you pay for it, outcomes-based funding. Is it going to be in addition to the current formula funding, or is it going to be part of the formula funding? And I think there's a difference between the House and the Senate on that, but I think it's in the range of $165 million that would have to be added to the formulas in order to make it separate, so it's a large number. And then the last point is really look at, create a timeline for new non-formula items when they're introduced and really track them and make sure we're getting a return on investment and do they need to continue. So those were the recommendations. So this is something that happened several years ago, but it might be something you'll hear about as you go along. Fixed tuition is required as an option. It has to be an option at each institution to allow a student to choose to pay tuition at the same rate for the 4 years that they're there, or 12 semester credit hours, with no increases. So at the University of Texas at Austin, we call it traditional tuition, meaning, you know, it may go up every year by some percentage based on what the Board of Regents approve, or a student could choose what we call a guaranteed tuition program where the rate stays the same all 4 years. And so that was effective in 2014, so just so you know, your institutions will have that.
Why would a student choose the We're going up every year.
Well, generally, so when when each institution sets their guaranteed tuition rate, it's generally higher because you're having to account for, 4 years from now, what it's going to be. It's kind of a gamble either way because we've had a lot of years where Board of Regents have not approved tuition increases. And so, those students may have been paying higher tuition for no reason, but it's, we have at UT Austin, we have about 1,000 students out of roughly 7,500 a year that take it, the guaranteed program. And some of them get in and say, oh, that's not what I meant. and we give them a period of time to change their mind. Another question? Okay. So I'll go through this quickly so I can leave a little bit of time for questions, but just to give you an idea of what institutions are doing on their campuses and how they're setting up budgets and funding. So as I said at the beginning, we kind of have different colors of money, so we have to track it all differently. And the appropriated funds, that term at the top, is what we receive from the state, and those are really formula general revenue, what we talked about already, and then GR dedicated, it's called local funds. Really, we manage those funds, but they're considered as part of the formula. So when they do the calculations for the formula, it is offset by the amount of statutory tuition they expect us to receive. And so that's really the state. And then the other income, available university fund, tobacco endowment, higher education fund, the National Research University Fund, all of these things are considered appropriated or state-type funds. And then we have designated funds, and so part of our tuition is considered statutory and appropriated, and then the designated tuition is separate, and that is basically the tuition that several years ago the state deregulated tuition and gave Board of Regents the authorization to set tuition, and that's what designated tuition is. It is set by each Board of Regents. And there's incidental fees and some indirect cost recovery money from federal funds, and so we have to keep that separate. And then auxiliary enterprises, I gave you some examples: athletics, housing and dining, recreational sports. Those are all like mini businesses. They pay their own expenses out of the revenue that they generate. They pay their own utilities, but they are within our budgets, and we do track them separately. Restricted funds are really important. This is where donations, endowments, federal grants, and contracts, these are very restricted. We can only use them for the purpose for which we receive them. If it's a grant, it can only be used for the deliverable, and so these are very separate funds. We can't get an endowment in for a chair and say, oh, we're going to use it to pay faculty salaries. It can only be used for what it was received. Yes?
When you talk about the auxiliary enterprises, what percentage of the athletic revenue ends up back in, say, like the general funds?
It doesn't actually end up back in general funds, but there are things that, so all our auxiliaries at most of the institutions pay some type of administrative fee. So for the services of administration to our athletics department, they pay 5% of their expenses go back to the university to help fund the administrative costs that they're using. And then it could vary by institution, but some athletic departments give back to the university in various ways, maybe through their trademark licensing funds, like we do at UT Austin, but others may have different ways of doing that. But so they don't go back into the general funds, but they go back to support the operations of the university. And they do pay their own utilities and their own debt service and that type of thing. So this is just a high level, this is a report that every institution does on their sources and uses, and this is just a 2017 look at the total $14.6 billion in just general academic institutions and where their sources of funds are. So the budget cycle varies a little bit, whether it's a legislative session or not. So we're getting ready to go into a legislative session, and so we really can't develop our entire budget until we know what our state funding is going to be. So really, after the legislative session ends in May, then we finalize the budgets and the budget policies in the summer time frame. And the Board of Regents approve it in the August time frame, and then it becomes effective September 1st. We all prepare a legislative appropriation request, and that's really something that goes to the Legislative Budget Board to provide information on what our historical expenses have been in all the areas. We provide a lot of information on our non-formula funding in the LAR, and so this is just a document that goes through the legislative process, and the LBB really uses it to get a comprehensive look and to prepare their statewide information for during the legislative session, and to adjust it as they go through the session and make changes on, you know, what the House and the Senate are doing for their various bills. We are also doing fiscal notes, which are analysis of all of the bills. So we're going through a legislative session. Bills come in, and we look at them and decide how they're impacting or how they might impact if the bill is passed. Is it going to cost us money to implement? Are we going to get revenue from it? Those types of things. And then, of course, we're looking at, as the bills come in, we're looking the appropriation bill, we're looking at how it will impact us funding-wise. Are we going to get an increase? Are we going to see a reduction? Those types of things. And then in a non-legislative year, it's the second year of the biennium, so we already know what the legislative funding is going to be, so the process starts a little bit earlier. And then just, as I was walking by the session before this, I heard them talking about how you have to be careful about what you say, and this is an example. We are, you know, always in the news. There's donors and alumni who want to make sure we're handling their funds appropriately. We report to Board of Regents. We've got legislature, parents, general public, and media that are looking at us, so we do have to be careful and transparent about how we're spending our funds. We are always looking at funding sources, and are there incremental expenses and for initiatives that we may need to provide? So there's a lot of things that are going on a daily basis on a campus to really fund the priorities and try to be as efficient as possible. And that's really what I wanted to cover, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I know we've got just a few minutes. Yes?
So who changed, when was the name changed from special items to non-formula items? Because the last session, I just kept hearing politicians complain about special items.
Yeah.
And so
It was last session. Yeah. It was.
Yeah, we got rid of special items.
Yeah, we did. We have no special items anymore. We have non-formula items. I think it was a way to just start moving in the direction of looking at them as in a different way. I don't know. It's hard for me because I've called them special items for so many years, but they are special usually.
Could you speak to, you had mentioned earlier that some of the recommendations that came out of that committee related to doing away with the weighted formula, more towards a semester hour formula. You had a chart earlier that had all sorts of variables from a 1.0 on the
Right,
chart
right.
all the way to a 28x pharmacy.
Yeah.
Maybe higher than that if
Right.
it's a doctoral program.
Yeah.
Like 69. So some really crazy numbers.
Yeah.
Does those two relate to some of that weighting go away, are you saying?
Well, that's
How
what,
so there's a great disparity between a 1 and a 69 on multiple.
right, and I'm not real sure,
Yeah.
yeah, this was a very, a committee that met very quickly and came out with recommendations fairly quickly, and I don't know that all of the details behind how that would be implemented have been done yet, and it is, that would be a very big change. And there are, during the legislative session, there will be a lot of that analysis, I'm sure, if there are bills introduced to do that. Jeff, do you have anything to add to that you know? Jeff used to work at the Legislative Budget Board, so he's here from UT Austin.
No, if the matrix that applies for weighted semester credit hours, that's the formula methodology the legislature's used in the past. They've chosen to support funding for higher education based on weighted semester credit hours. If they move to per student funding, that really would structurally change the formula and likely do away with weighted semester credit hours. But that matrix is in place as a weight of a 1. If you have a 500 student lower division class, you have a lot more students there versus funding a doctoral class the way to 69 or a very small subset of pharmacy. The basic point of the question, yes, if they move to per student funding, it's a complete structural change to the formula.
Yeah. Yes?
I got a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
One involves Robinhood, one involves lottery. So how restricted is the state in allocating those funds? How are we assured that they're going to education? It's lottery proceeds or Robinhood?
I'm not involved in that at all, but, I think when the lottery initially came out, it was, touted as being for public education, but I think it was more flexible than that in actuality. But as far as Robinhood, I believe all those funds are in the public education funds, and I don't think I do believe they go to public education. But I am not an expert in that area, so I don't want to, I think we've got to end. Do you have one more question real quick? Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.